The veteran silently kept working on his bike. "You can't even fix it," the biker continued. "Guess you haven't been in the game for a while." The other bikers snickered, filming on their phones. The small town of Burlington, Iowa, in 1992 was quiet and unassuming, a place where everyone knew everyone else's business and life moved slowly. For John Jack Hartman, a veteran of World War II, this was both a blessing and a curse. After years of solitude, the echoes of the past still haunted him, yet he had learned to carve out a semblance of peace in his aging home. The years had passed, and Jack had long since retired from the small construction job he once held. Each day, he followed a simple routine. He tended to his garden, made small repairs around the house, and took long walks through the empty streets of Burlington. His life was marked by a rhythm of quiet solitude, the kind of existence that had allowed him to age gracefully but left him increasingly distant from the world around him. On this particular afternoon, after stopping by the local store to grab a few essentials, Jack returned home to a scene that would disrupt his usual calm. As he rounded the corner onto his street, a loud roar reached his ears, a sound he hadn't heard in years. A group of young people, all on motorcycles, had come to town. The engines of their bikes reverberated through the streets, making the quiet town feel small and unimportant in comparison to their boisterous presence. The group sped through the center of town, their laughter and loud revving engines cutting through the usual stillness like a sharp knife. Jack, annoyed but not surprised, stopped in his tracks as one of the riders made a reckless turn and came dangerously close to his fence. The rider's motorcycle screeched, its tires skimming the dirt, and for a moment Jack thought the man might plow through his well-kept garden. It was a fleeting moment, but it felt like an invasion. Jack's once pristine flowers, the ones he had carefully tended to over the years, were nearly destroyed by the rider's careless maneuver. He watched, his eyes narrowing, as the biker sped off into the distance, unaware of the small disaster he'd just caused. Jack's immediate response was to huff and mutter under his breath, but he didn't go after the biker. It wasn't worth the trouble. The young man was long gone, and the disruption seemed temporary. Yet as he stood there for a moment longer, watching the dust settle in his garden, Jack felt a surge of frustration rise within him. This wasn't the world he had known, the world where everything was orderly and quiet, where respect for the old was evident in the way people behaved. He returned to his house, shaking his head, hoping the noise would die down quickly. But it lingered in his mind, as if the presence of those bikes had somehow triggered something deep within him. The noise seemed louder than ever now, echoing in his ears long after the bikers had gone. As he walked through the door of his home, the familiar creaks of the wooden floor beneath his boots seemed to welcome him back to the safety of solitude. But his thoughts were restless, his peace disturbed by the intrusion of something foreign, something unsettling. His once steady hands trembled slightly as he set down his groceries and looked out the window, watching the streets below. Everything seemed out of place now. The world had shifted, and he was no longer part of it. The town that had once been a comfort, a haven for the elderly and quiet, now felt like an alien landscape. Jack's old, somewhat blurred vision made it harder to discern the details of the world around him, but even in his dim perception, he could feel the change. The streets, which had once been familiar, now felt threatening and cold. There was a shift in the air, something heavy and foreign that he couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the noise of the motorcycles or the careless disregard for his property. It was something more, something he couldn't articulate but could feel deep in his bones. The world was no longer his own, and he wasn't sure how to adjust. The simple, quiet life he had built over the years felt increasingly out of reach, swallowed by forces he didn't understand and couldn't control. Jack stood by the window, watching the faint outline of the motorcycles disappear into the distance, and he wondered How many more days he would have to endure this new world, this world where the old and quiet were no longer welcomed. The following day, Jack decided to take a walk through the heart of Burlington, a town he had known for years, but now it seemed strange to him, as if it had changed overnight. The streets, once so familiar and comfortable, felt more foreign than ever. The peace of the small town had been shattered, and Jack could feel it in the air, thick with the presence of those motorcycles and their riders. He wasn't used to this new, loud world, but today he couldn't escape it. As he passed the old diner at the corner of Main Street, he noticed the group of bikers again, this time gathered around the outdoor tables, laughing and causing a ruckus. The scene before him was both overwhelming and unsettling. The bikers, clad in leather jackets, tattoos marking their skin, and eyes full of confidence, seemed to claim the street for themselves. The clink of beer bottles and their boisterous laughter filled the air, making it difficult for Jack to walk through without feeling out of place. It wasn't just the noise that unsettled him. It was the sheer force of their presence. They weren't just passing through. They were taking over, claiming the very heart of the town. Jack tried to keep his head down, hoping to avoid any attention, but it was impossible to ignore them. Among the group, one figure stood out. A tall man with a commanding presence, he moved with the assuredness of someone who had long since learned how to control a room. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd, taking in everything with a calculating gaze. This was Victor "Vic" Grayson, the leader of the Rust Wings Biker Club. Jack had heard his name before. Whispers in the wind about the man who ruled the streets with an iron fist. He was a local legend, known for his ruthless reputation and unyielding authority. Some said he had ties to the darker corners of the town. Others whispered of his violent past. But what was certain was that Vic Grayson always got what he wanted as Jack walked by. He tried to avoid drawing attention, but fate had other plans. One of the bikers, a younger man with a wild grin plastered across his face, spotted him. Without hesitation, he shouted a comment at Jack, poking fun at his weathered appearance. Jack's old age had become a target for ridicule, as if his years of life were nothing more than a reason for others to laugh. Though the words stung, Jack didn't respond. He kept his head low, continuing on his path, determined not to let them get to him. But in the back of his mind, something shifted. He felt it. The unmistakable sting of being treated like an outsider in his own town. The laughter, the taunts, it all seemed to echo in his ears as he walked past. He was used to being ignored, to walking alone, but now it felt different. It was as if the world had suddenly become a hostile place, and he was no longer a part of it. The mocking words from the young biker made him realize just how disconnected he had become from the community he had once known. He wasn't just the old man who lived down the street anymore. To them, he was invisible, something to laugh at, something to pass by without a second thought. Jack quickened his pace, trying to distance himself from the group. He told himself that it was just a moment, a brief interruption, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed permanently. The town he had spent his entire life in was no longer the same. These bikers, with their defiant attitudes and their loud presence, had taken hold of it, and he was left standing on the outside looking in. He made a decision then. He would stay away from the diner, stay away from the areas where they gathered. It wasn't worth the trouble. He didn't want to be a part of their world. The thought of walking through those streets again, knowing he would be met with mockery and disrespect, was too much to bear. Jack's heart grew heavy with the weight of his thoughts. He had always been independent, self-reliant, and proud. But now it seemed as though the world had moved on without him, leaving him behind in the dust. As Jack made his way back home, the sound of the bikes faded into the distance, but the feeling of isolation lingered. He didn't know how to reconcile his place in a world that had become unfamiliar and unwelcoming. The town, once a refuge, now felt cold and alien. And Jack, for the first time in years, wondered if he had a place in it anymore. Several days had passed since Jack's uncomfortable encounter with the bikers. The weather had shifted to the crispness of early autumn, and the leaves were beginning to turn vibrant hues of orange and yellow. It was a typical morning in Burlington, one of those quiet, calm days where the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the town's empty streets. Jack, in his usual manner, had planned to make his routine trip to the local store. He would gather a few groceries, perhaps stop at the hardware store for a new wrench or two, and return home to his solitude. Today, he decided to take the familiar route across the town's main street, where the sound of roaring engines had become a part of the landscape. Jack had been avoiding the area for some time now, his discomfort with the bikers still fresh in his mind. But today, there was a sense of purpose in him. He couldn't let their presence dominate his life. He wouldn't be intimidated by their noise or their stares. The old town was still his town, and he would walk its streets as he had always done. He mounted his aging bicycle, the one he had ridden for years, its wheels worn and its frame chipped from constant use. The bike had served him well over the years, through hot summers, cold winters, and countless errands. It had become part of his identity, a symbol of his independence, a link to his past. Jack could still remember when he had bought it, many years ago, and how it had felt to ride it for the first time, the wind rushing past his face, the sense of freedom it gave him. But now the bicycle was starting to show signs of wear. The gears slipped, the chain creaked, and the tires no longer had the same smooth glide. As he pedaled down the road, Jack's mind wandered. The distant hum of a motorcycle engine reached his ears, and he instinctively glanced up. The familiar group of bikers was gathering again at the Rust Wings clubhouse. Their bikes were lined up in rows, chrome gleaming in the sun, and their riders, loud and confident, were milling about, laughing and shouting. Jack could feel a knot tightening in his stomach. They seemed to be everywhere now, occupying the spaces he used to claim as his own. The air felt heavier as he pedaled closer, and he could hear the occasional burst of laughter from the group, the clinking of bottles, the sounds of life that felt foreign to him. He reached the spot where his old path would veer off into the quieter side streets, but for some reason, today he continued forward, passing the corner where the Rust Wings clubhouse stood. It was a decision he didn't think through. He simply did it. Perhaps it was a small rebellion, an act of defiance against the shadow the bikers cast over the town, or perhaps it was just the weight of routine pushing him forward. But as he pedaled past the clubhouse, something unexpected happened. The front tire of his bike hit a small stone in the road, and with a sudden jolt, it buckled. The next thing Jack knew, he was thrown off balance, his body jerking forward and crashing into the pavement. The fall wasn't violent, but it was enough to leave him winded. He lay there for a moment, stunned by the abruptness of it, before slowly pushing himself up. His hands were sore, and his knees ached as he bent to assess the damage. The front tire had buckled, the spokes twisted in unnatural angles. The chain had come off its gears, and the brakes squealed as he attempted to move the bike. Jack grunted in frustration. The bike that had served him faithfully for so long was no longer in working condition. He could feel a pang of helplessness rising in his chest. This wasn't just a mechanical failure, it was a metaphor, and unwelcome. Reminder that time was catching up with him. Trying to ignore the aching in his body, Jack knelt down and began to work on the bike. His hands, once quick and steady, now trembled slightly as he attempted to fix the tire. The small toolbox he carried with him was almost useless, filled with mismatched wrenches and rusted pliers. He fumbled through the tools, trying to find the right one, but his fingers, stiff with age, struggled to grip them. The task was simple enough, but the simple act of fixing something had become more difficult than it had ever been before. As he worked, Jack's mind raced. It wasn't just the bike. It was everything. The world had changed so much, and he couldn't keep up. His body had begun to betray him, and his hands, once strong and sure, now failed him in the most mundane tasks. He could feel the weight of his age pressing down on him like an invisible force. He had lived his life with pride, always doing things for himself. But now, in this moment, he couldn't even fix his own bike. The thought stung more than he was willing to admit, and then, like a shadow creeping closer, the sound of laughter reached his ears. He looked up to see the group of bikers from the Rust Wings clubhouse gathering nearby. They were watching him. Their eyes were fixed on him, their grins wide. Jack could hear their low chuckles, the whispered comments exchanged between them. He didn't need to hear the words to understand. They were laughing at him, the old man struggling with something as simple as a bicycle. Jack's stomach churned with embarrassment, but he refused to look up, refusing to let them see his face. He didn't want to give them the satisfaction. One of the bikers, a tall man with a rough beard and a leather jacket, stepped closer. He looked down at Jack, his eyes scanning the scene with a mixture of amusement and disdain. Another biker, younger and faster to judge, let out a loud laugh, pointing at Jack's failed attempts to fix the bike. The others followed suit, snickering and pointing fingers, their mockery filling the air. It felt like they were circling him, like vultures waiting for the old man to break. Jack's face flushed, but he refused to meet their gaze. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter. Instead, he kept his eyes on the bike, ignoring the growing noise around him. His hands, shaking more now, gripped the tools with all the strength he could muster, but the task seemed increasingly impossible. He wasn't sure if the bike was beyond repair or if it was his own hands that had failed him. But either way, he couldn't fix it. He couldn't do it alone anymore. The pride that had once sustained him was slowly starting to crack. Despite their jeers, Jack didn't ask for help. His pride, his stubbornness, and his loneliness held him back. He could feel their eyes on him, the weight of their ridicule pressing down. But he continued working. He wouldn't let them see how badly they had affected him. He would fix this bike, no matter how long it took, but the bikers were relentless. One by one, they pulled out their phones, their laughter growing louder as they began recording Jack's struggle. The cameras flicked on, the flashing lights making it feel as though he were performing on a stage he didn't want to be on. The bull. Humiliation washed over him, but still he refused to stop. He focused on the task at hand, tuning out the voices around him, even as they grew louder, more mocking. As Jack fumbled with the tools, he noticed the bikes getting closer, their engines revving in the background. The noise seemed to drown out everything else, and for a brief moment, Jack could almost forget where he was. Almost. But then, as he adjusted the chain, the bike tilted awkwardly, the weight of his groceries making it unstable. It fell over, sending cans of soup and jars of pickles rolling across the pavement. The sound of metal clattering against asphalt was sharp, like a crack breaking through the silence of his mind. It was the final blow. The bike was truly beyond repair. The laughter grew louder, and Jack knew it was only a matter of time before. They approached him, mocking him for the mess he had made. But even as his pride crumbled, he refused to ask for help. His dignity was still intact, even if his bike was not. Jack's hands trembled as he attempted one last time to reconnect the chain, the final effort of many attempts to fix the bike. His pride had carried him through decades of life, but it felt as though that pride was slipping away, one shaky movement at a time. His body, once strong and capable, now betrayed him at every turn. The familiar tools in his hands seemed foreign now, the weight of the wrench too heavy, the pliers too awkward in his grasp. The sun overhead beat down on him relentlessly, as if the world itself was testing him, pushing him to his limits. The sound of the biker's laughter still filled the air, though now it was a bit more distant, as if the amusement had started to fade. Jack, too proud to ask for help, had resorted to silence. His face, flushed with the sting of embarrassment, remained unreadable. He had been so certain that he could fix it himself, but now it seemed impossible. The frustration mounted with each futile attempt, each turn of the wrench that failed to tighten the chain, each effort that brought him no closer to success. He had come to a point where surrendering felt inevitable, where admitting defeat seemed like the only option left. As Jack sat back on his heels, wiping the sweat from his brow, he could feel the weight of the eyes upon him once more. The bikers had gathered closer now, a ring of onlookers around him, their phones raised to capture his struggle. They had stopped laughing, but the stillness around him felt far more menacing. It was as if they were waiting for him to crack, to break under the weight of his pride and age. Jack knew they were looking for something, perhaps a moment of weakness, perhaps a show of despair, but he refused to give it to them. His shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time he felt the weight of his years settle on him in a way that was undeniable. He was tired, not just from the physical exertion of trying to repair the bike, but from the weight of it all. The mocking stares, the laughter, the sense that he no longer belonged in the world around him. He had fought for so many years in different ways. But today, the battle seemed too much. The bike, the laughter, the people. It was all too much. Jack's hands lowered to his sides, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to acknowledge the truth: he could not do it alone. The realization stung, but there was no escaping it. Then, from the corner of his eye, Jack saw a figure approach. At first he didn't recognize him, but as the man drew closer, there was no mistaking who it was. Victor Grayson, the leader of the Rust Wings Biker Club, moved toward him with an air of calm confidence that seemed to defy the tension in the air. Jack's initial instinct was to shrink back, to retreat into the small world of his own shame. But something about the way Victor approached him made him pause. It was as though the world around them momentarily fell silent, as if everything had slowed to a crawl. Victor did not speak at first. He simply crouched down beside Jack, his presence overwhelming yet somehow calming. Jack, confused and surprised by the sudden attention, looked up at him, his mind racing for a response, for words, but none came. Victor's eyes met his for a moment, and there was something in that gaze, something deeper than the rough exterior of the man. Victor didn't laugh, he didn't mock, he didn't even speak a word. Instead, without hesitation, he reached out and gently took the bike from Jack's hands. Jack, still processing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, found himself momentarily stunned. For a long moment, he didn't know what to do. He wanted to protest, to say something, anything, but the words never came. Victor simply took the bike and began inspecting it with a calm, deliberate focus. His hands moved with a practiced ease, methodical and sure. Jack, still kneeling beside him, felt a strange sense of humility wash over him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to acknowledge that he couldn't fix the bike. The bikers who had once surrounded Jack, laughing and pointing, were now strangely silent. Their phones were lowered, their eyes fixed on Victor, who moved with a level of respect and care that none of them had expected. It was as if the whole atmosphere had shifted in an instant. The light-hearted mocking that had dominated moments ago had been replaced with an eerie quiet, as though they too were now uncertain about how to react. Victor pulled a small toolkit from the compartment of his motorcycle. The tools were clean, well organized, and gleamed in the sunlight. It was clear that Victor knew his way around machines, his fingers moving with precision as he set to work on the broken bicycle. Jack, who had struggled with the simplest of repairs, watched in awe as Victor worked with such ease, as if the bike were just another thing he had mastered over the years. There was something almost reverent in the way Victor handled the bike. His focus was absolute, every movement thoughtful and deliberate. It was as though fixing this bike was the most important thing in the world to him at that moment. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of respect for the man, a respect that was completely different from the mockery he had endured just moments earlier. This man, this biker, was treating the bike with care and attention, not as something to be ridiculed, but as something that deserved respect. And in that moment, Jack realized that Victor's actions were more than just a simple repair. They were an unspoken gesture of understanding, an acknowledgement of Jack's struggle. As Victor continued to work, the bikers, who had once found amusement in Jack's failed attempts, began to shift. The silence that hung in the air was thick with uncertainty, and Jack could see the change in their faces. They were watching Victor, but they were also watching themselves. The mockery had dissipated, replaced by something else. Perhaps an unspoken recognition of the honor that Victor had extended to Jack. Jack stood there, his eyes following Victor's every movement, feeling a strange mix of emotions. His pride, the part of him that had always stood alone, had cracked wide open. He had always prided himself on being independent, on being able to do everything himself. But in that moment, he understood that asking for help didn't make him weak. It made him human. And Victor, with his quiet strength, had given him a glimpse of something he hadn't known he needed, the realization that he wasn't alone in this world. Victor finished his work, and with a final adjustment, he stood up. He didn't say a word, but his actions spoke volumes. He had done what Jack couldn't, not out of pity or charity, but out of respect. He had seen Jack's struggle, not as a weakness, but as a testament to his resilience. And in that moment, Jack's perspective shifted. The world didn't have to be a place where he fought alone. It could be a place where help, even from the most unlikely sources, was something to be accepted. Jack watched as Victor wiped his hands on a rag and stood back, surveying the now repaired bike. For a brief moment, the bikers stood in silence, the air thick with an unspoken understanding. Jack, who had once felt small and insignificant, now stood taller, his heart lighter, as if the weight of the world had been momentarily lifted from his shoulders. The bike was fixed. The task that had seemed impossible just moments before was now complete. And in the quiet that followed, Jack realized that sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with strength, but with the quiet acts of kindness and respect that come from unexpected places. The sunlight had already begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement, when Victor stood back from the bike, his work complete. He stepped away from the now fully repaired bicycle, wiping his hands clean on a rag that had been hanging from his belt. His movements were slow, deliberate. He had worked with care, his attention never straying from the task at hand. The bike, once an object of failure in Jack's eyes, now gleamed with a new quiet strength, the chain firmly in place, the tires solid and true. It was no longer the broken, half-finished project it had been just an hour ago. In Victor's hands, it had been restored not just mechanically, but in a way that made it whole again. Jack stood off to the side, watching in quiet awe. He hadn't expected this. In the moments before Victor had approached, Jack had felt a kind of helplessness he hadn't known in years. He had been ready to give up, to let the bike be just one more reminder of his age, his fragility, his inability to keep up with the world around him. But now the bike was whole again, and for the first time that day, Jack felt like there was something more to be gained from this encounter than just a fixed bike. As Victor turned to face him, Jack's mind began to process what had just transpired. He had expected mockery, derision, perhaps even a sense of superiority from Victor, given the way the man's reputation had preceded him. But instead, Victor had done something Jack hadn't anticipated at all. He had treated the task of fixing the bike as though it were important, as though Jack's struggle mattered. It wasn't about power or dominance. It was about something else, something quieter, something far less tangible. It was respect. Jack had never considered that Victor could show him that kind of respect, and now, standing there with his bike restored, Jack wasn't quite sure what to make of it. Victor stepped toward him, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel beneath them. He didn't say a word at first, his gaze lingering on Jack for a moment. The other bikers, who had been silent spectators throughout the repair, were still watching, but now the atmosphere had shifted. The tension from earlier had dissolved, replaced by something new, something subtle. Jack could feel it in the air, the shift from mockery to something more complex, more nuanced. These bikers, who had once found his struggle amusing, were now watching him with a kind of curiosity, as though they had just witnessed something they hadn't expected to see. As Victor placed the bike in front of Jack, he nodded slightly. Jack hesitated for a moment, still processing everything that had happened, but when Victor's eyes met his, he found himself unable to refuse. It wasn't just the bike, it was everything. Victor's quiet acknowledgement of Jack's presence, of his struggle, of his place in this world, made something inside Jack stir. It was the kind of acknowledgement that came only after a kind of battle, one fought not with fists or words, but with actions. Victor didn't offer any further words. He didn't need to. His presence, his actions, had already spoken louder than anything that could be said. But there was a sense of invitation in his eyes, a quiet question of whether Jack needed anything more. For a brief moment, Jack considered asking for something else, some kind of further gesture, perhaps an invitation into their world, but he quickly discarded the thought. This moment, this quiet exchange of respect, was enough. It was more than enough. As Victor stepped back, the bikers who had been observing began to disperse, each going back to their own business, their eyes a little less mocking, a little more thoughtful. Jack could feel their gazes on him as they walked away, but the weight of their scrutiny had lessened. In a way, they had all witnessed something that none of them had expected, a kind of recognition, a kind of understanding that had grown between two people from different worlds, neither of them willing to admit it at first, but both of them feeling it in the quiet aftermath of Victor's actions. As the bikers drifted back into their world, Jack stood still for a moment longer, his hands resting lightly on the handlebars of his bike. He could feel the presence of the man who had fixed it, but Victor was already walking away, his steps heavy but measured. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt something shift within him, a realization that had been coming for a while, but had only just fully dawned on him. He wasn't alone. The world didn't have to be a place where he fought to stay relevant, where he struggled to keep his footing. Victor had shown him that, even in a place like this, surrounded by people who seemed so different from him, there could be understanding, there could be respect. It was the kind of realization that struck Jack with a quiet force, as though he had spent years not seeing something that had been right in front of him the whole time. That evening, as Jack rode his bike back home, he felt the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him, but in a way that felt less heavy, less burdensome than before. The sun was setting, the streets growing quieter as the day faded into dusk. The world seemed a little softer now, a little more open. As he pedaled along the familiar path, his mind wandered back to the bikers, to Victor, to the strange turn his day had taken. He hadn't expected any of this. He hadn't expected Victor to fix the bike, to treat him with respect, to show him that kindness in a way that felt genuine and unforced. And yet, as he thought about it, Jack realized that he had made assumptions about people he had never taken the time to understand. He had painted Victor and the other bikers with a broad brush, believing them to be the enemy, the strangers who didn't belong in the quiet world he had built for himself. But now, as the evening air cooled his face and the sounds of the town settled into their familiar rhythm, Jack realized that he had been wrong. Perhaps he had been wrong about a lot of things. Perhaps he had underestimated the power of connection, the importance of seeing people for who they truly were, not just who he had assumed them to be. And perhaps in some strange way, Victor and the bikers had shown him that people weren't always what they seemed, that even those who seemed the most unlikely to offer help or understanding could surprise you when you least expected it. As Jack reached the door of his small home, the bike rolling smoothly beneath him, he paused for a moment before entering. The quiet of the evening felt different now. There was a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just going inside to escape. He was going inside to reflect, to sit with the realization that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as cold as he had once believed it to be. In the days that followed, Jack's thoughts lingered on the bikers, on Victor, and on the strange turn his life had taken. He found himself walking through the town a little differently, his shoulders a little straighter, his mind a little clearer. The people he had once viewed with suspicion now felt like a part of the landscape, not the enemy, not strangers. And though he still walked alone, he no longer felt quite so isolated. The world had opened up to him in a way that he hadn't expected, and in that quiet recognition, Jack began to see something he had missed all along, that sometimes respect, understanding, and connection come from the most unexpected places. Several days passed since Jack's encounter with Victor and the bikers, and the weight of those moments had begun to settle within him, changing the way he saw the world around him. The once familiar streets of Burlington now felt different, the air around him no longer thick with the same isolation he had carried for so long. Jack found himself walking with more confidence, a subtle shift in his gait that seemed to reflect a change within him. He no longer avoided the area where the bikers gathered. The tension he had once felt when passing by their clubhouse had diminished, replaced with a quiet curiosity. It wasn't that he had suddenly embraced their world. No, that was too much to expect. Jack still preferred the quieter corners of the town, the parts where the hum of motorcycles didn't disturb the stillness of the morning. But something had shifted inside him. He had allowed the walls around him to come down just a little, and that was enough to change how he moved through the world. His pride, the thing that had kept him from asking for help, had softened, and in its place was a newfound understanding that life could be about more than solitary battles. It was one evening, as the sun was setting behind the distant hills, when Jack saw Victor again. Jack had been walking along the main street, the familiar rhythm of his footsteps echoing softly against the pavement, when he spotted Victor leaning against his motorcycle, his sharp eyes scanning the street. As Jack approached, Victor straightened up, his gaze locking onto Jack's for a moment, before he gave a slight nod. It was a small gesture, but Jack felt it, a kind of silent recognition, a signal that Victor hadn't forgotten their interaction, hadn't forgotten the respect that had passed between them. Victor's presence was as commanding as ever, but there was something different now in the way he carried himself. He wasn't the same man Jack had initially assumed him to be, the ruthless, untouchable biker who ruled the streets. Now there was a quiet dignity in his movements, something grounded, something that Jack couldn't quite place but felt nonetheless. "Hey, old man," Victor called out, his voice gruff but not unkind. "How about you come inside for a drink?" Jack hesitated for a moment. The invitation caught him off guard. He wasn't sure what to make of it. The idea of stepping into the bar, stepping into the world of the bikers, felt both exciting and daunting. It wasn't the kind of thing he had ever imagined himself doing, but something inside him, something he couldn't quite define, urged him to accept. His hand rested on the handlebar of his bicycle, and he stood there for a moment, contemplating. He had spent years avoiding situations like this, keeping himself distanced from people he didn't understand, from worlds he didn't belong to. But now, in the aftermath of everything that had happened, Jack realized that the walls he had built around himself were not as necessary as he once thought. He had spent so much of his life trying to maintain a certain image, a certain pride, but that pride had come at the cost of connection. Perhaps, he thought, this was his chance to step beyond that, to let go of some of the rigid ideas that had kept him isolated for so long. After a moment of silence, Jack nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but enough for Victor to understand. Without a word, Victor turned and headed toward the door of the clubhouse, motioning for Jack to follow. Jack paused for a brief moment before walking behind him, the familiar creak of his old boots against the pavement mixing with the louder sound of Victor's heavy steps as they entered the clubhouse. Jack felt a surge of discomfort, but it was tempered by a sense of curiosity. The dim lighting inside cast long shadows across the tables, and the sound of rock music filled the air. But the energy in the room was different from what Jack had imagined. The bikers, who had once seemed like a rowdy, unruly crowd, now appeared more like a tight-knit group of individuals who had formed their own sense of camaraderie. Victor walked to the bar, and the others in the room, those who had been sitting around the tables and chatting, stood up when they saw him. Jack's eyes widened in surprise. There was no jeering, no laughter, no mocking looks. Instead, the bikers greeted him with a kind of solemn respect, nodding their heads, some even offering him a brief smile. It was as though, in that moment, Jack was no longer an outsider to them. He was someone who had earned their respect simply by being present, by accepting Victor's invitation. Jack stood still for a moment, taking it all in. The rough, wild group of bikers, who he had once thought of as nothing more than troublemakers, had now transformed before his eyes. They weren't just the loud, untamed individuals he had imagined. They were people with their own code, their own sense of honor. The respect they showed him was unexpected, but it felt real. They were acknowledging him not as an old man who didn't belong, but as someone who had earned his place in the world, someone who had shown strength in his own way. Victor, who had been talking to the bartender, turned to Jack and motioned for him to join them. Jack walked over to the bar, where Victor had already ordered a drink for him. The other bikers, who had been talking among themselves, now fell into a respectful silence, their eyes lingering on Jack for a moment before they returned to their conversations. Jack could feel their gaze, but this time it didn't bother him. He wasn't the subject of mockery or ridicule. He was simply a part of the room, a part of the group. As he took a sip of the drink Victor had ordered for him, Jack felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't just the alcohol. It was the realization that he wasn't alone anymore. The walls he had spent years building had been torn down, piece by piece, and in their place was something unexpected. Connection. The bikers, with their rough exteriors and their hard lives, had shown him a side of themselves that he had never imagined. They had shown him that respect wasn't something that only came from those who fit into society's neat boxes. It came from understanding, from shared experience, from the willingness to see another person not as an enemy, but as someone worthy of acknowledgement. As the evening wore on, Jack found himself becoming more comfortable. He wasn't just an outsider anymore. He was part of something, however strange it might seem. The bikers shared stories with him, not just about their wild rides or their past misdeeds, but about their lives, about the things they valued, about the struggles they had faced. Jack listened, absorbing it all. He found himself sharing a few stories of his own, stories that he had never told anyone. The sense of camaraderie in the room was palpable, and for the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he was part of something larger than himself. As he left the clubhouse that night, his mind was swirling with thoughts. He had walked in expecting to find a world of chaos and aggression, but instead he had found respect, understanding, and even a sense of brotherhood. The bikers weren't just a group of rowdy individuals. They were people who, despite their tough exterior, valued honor, loyalty, and respect. Burlington had always been a small town, but Jack realized that it was a place that had room for change, for growth. Even the most stubborn residents, even the ones who seemed set in their ways, could find room for new paths, new ways of thinking. Jack's journey had taught him that the world wasn't as rigid as he had once believed. Respect, true respect, could come from unexpected places, and sometimes it was in the most unlikely of encounters that one could find the most profound moments of change. The next morning, as Jack rode his bicycle through town, the familiar streets seemed less empty than they had before. The bikers, the ones he had once feared, now nodded at him as he passed. He didn't just ride past them. He was part of their world now, a world where respect wasn't just given based on appearances, but based on understanding. And that realization, that there was always room for change, always room for a new path, made all the difference. Jack rode on, no longer the outsider, but someone who had found a new way forward.